Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your Friday evening to join me for this discussion. I want to respect the town hall nature of it, so even though I do have several slides, I would like to, go through them quick and then intersperse questions as we go along. And if there are more substantive responses that are warranted, maybe we could save those for the last half hour. Forgive me for starting late. We had a bit of technical difficulties, but I'm so glad to see you all here. There are some refreshments towards the side. There are restrooms if you need them. And hey, Dawn. And definitely make yourself comfortable. I want to thank Red Door Childcare and Learning Centers for giving me this chance to use their space to put on this presentation. Sonia, can you do the next slide? So this presentation is sponsored by This Life Works, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families of children that are impacted by developmental disabilities. So as part of our initiative to raise awareness about special needs and advocacy, we've created this monthly town hall series. It's a speaker series where we hope to bring together parents, members of the community, professionals, everyone who has the same goal of learning more about how they can help their child progress in the manner that they should. So the title, Sonia, if you could go back to, the title of this presentation is Overcoming Barriers to Accessing a High Quality Special Education. And I'm going to be examining the impact of race and national origin and economic status, or as a whole, socioeconomic status. So the reason why I titled it a high quality special education as opposed to just education in general is because it's so important that we make sure what we're offering our children is what they need in order to make progress. So high quality, I mean that it's specifically tailored to meet your child's needs. And I feel that without the knowledge about what a child's entitled to, you'll never get to that point of being selective and getting your child what they need. Okay, so next slide. So what qualifies me to give this presentation? I've been a special education attorney for 11 years. So I started off my career working for Bronx Legal Services, and I was representing low-income families with children with special needs. So during the time I spent there, I attended IEP meetings. I hope everyone knows what an IEP is. It's an individualized education program. So children with special needs, and I'm going to give it's a very brief overview on it. It's a plan that tracks the child's current levels of functioning, how they're testing academically, how they're assessed behaviorally and emotionally, and also physically, like whether they need physical therapy, occupational therapy. Gross motor skills are things like jumping and running. Fine motor skills are things like holding a pencil, zippering and unzippering their clothes, potty training. And so it also tracks goals. So goals are created. There's a team called the Committee on Special Education, and it consists of the parent, who's the most important member of that team. It can consist of the student if they're old enough to comprehend and provide some input into their education plan. And it also includes certain representatives of the school district. So there has to be a district representative who can interpret the results of an evaluation that the district does. There should be a special education teacher and also a general education teacher if the student has the ability to access general education, and usually a social worker as well, and the parent can bring an advocate or an attorney. So that's a really quick overview, but it can do a whole presentation just on the IEP itself. So I was doing that, and I was also representing families who were looking to litigate. So when the IEP is developed by this team, and the district has the final word in that IEP meeting, the parent has what we call due process rights. They have the right to challenge it. They don't automatically have to accept it. And in fact, any recommendations cannot be implemented without the parent's consent, written and informed consent. And so that's sort of the hallmark of what I did at Bronx Legal Services and what I'm doing now in my current capacity. So after working at Bronx Legal Services, I transitioned to the New York City Department of Education. So I worked there between 2013 and 2015, and I was in their settlements and claims unit underneath their special education department. And I was settling cases, so now where parents were bringing these cases challenging what the district was offering and demanding that the district pay for what they're looking for. I was the one behind the scenes negotiating those deals, whether it was private school tuition, a private evaluation that may be more comprehensive than what the district was had provided, and sometimes it's almost as simple as changing the classroom size from an 8 to 1 to 1, 8 students, 1 teacher, 1 teaching assistant, to a larger classroom or a smaller classroom. So it ran the gamut, but particularly this unit where I worked at the DOE dealt with private school tuition cases. So what some parents may not know is that there are a range of private schools for children with special needs. So there are schools for children with autism, there are schools for children with speech and language impairments, there are schools for children with dyslexia. There are not that many in terms of the realm. There is a need for more, but there are specialized schools that when the parent feels that the public, they've exhausted rather the options in the public school and perhaps the other recommendations that the public school has made, they then pursue this tuition funding or placement through the school district. After I left the DOE, New York City DOE, I joined a firm called Guercio & Guercio, which represents several Long Island school districts. And so while I worked with school district administrators, superintendents, school board members, I was this special education expert on that team, and I was there between 2015 to 2017. So I'm doing this presentation in my capacity as the founder and managing attorney of MSRLegal and Consulting Services. So this is a private practice that focuses on children's advocacy and special education law. The hallmark of my disability rights practice is really the partnerships between the medical and clinical and therapeutic team and legal, because with respect to special education, those two go hand in hand. And I feel strongly that forming those relationships and knowing that we can rely on each other results in the best outcome for the child. So next slide. Okay, so now we're going to dive into statistics, which I think you'll find as interesting as I did. So the total population of children with disabilities is approximately 13%. This is data taken from a few years ago, 2015-16 school year, made available a couple of years after that, 2017. And so this number makes sense, that most children can be educated in a general education environment, and that this segment of 13% would require some specialized instruction or services. And also you'll see that there is an outlier. So for example, Asian students, and this particular graph doesn't break down East Asian versus Southeast Asian, but as a whole, they are apparently less likely to be classified with a disability. Sonia, can you go to the next slide? So from that graph, what I gathered, there was a slight overrepresentation I found with Black or African American students, 16% versus 13% of the total population. Native Americans, even higher, 17%. And then what may be an underrepresentation, Asian students. So next slide. Okay, so this graph is a little more complicated, so I'm going to break it down. So now looking at let's say the overall grouping of students with disabilities according to race, we find that overall, for the most part, except for Asian students, and that represent 21% of children with 21% of that population have a specific learning disability. A learning disability tends to be the most common classification overall. So on this IEP that I mentioned before, there are, in New York State, 13 different disability classifications. I'm not going to go through all 13. These are the most common learning disability, so things like dyslexia may fall into that, some processing disorders that really impact a child's education. Speech and language impairment that you probably know, there are delays in receptive and expressive language, being able to understand language, take it in, and also to express it, to speak, and disorders that can impact a speech and language impairment include even structural oral motor difficulty, moving the actual mouth and tongue, and to be able to produce sound. So that is a disability in and of itself. Autism is a disability that impacts a child's ability to take in often language and take in sensory information such as light and sound. Sometimes there are sensitivities to touch, but it's most commonly known as a disorder that impacts a child's social skills and communication development. And intellectual disabilities, it used to be called mental retardation back when I was practicing in the Bronx, and during that time, about I don't know, 8-10 years ago, it changed to be more a more progressive classification. It's called intellectual disability. So when you think about that, it's more of IQs that fall well under the borderline range, if we're looking at IQ scores. Okay, next slide. So with that graph, again, the outliers, and we could talk, if anyone has insight about why that correlation exists. Asian students, they are least likely to be classified with a learning disability. So we saw that if we went back to that slide, we saw that it was in the 40% range for all the other racial or ethnic groups. But for Asians, it was, I think, 21%. But they were the most likely to be classified with autism. Okay, next slide. So the Individuals with Disabilities Act, we call it the IDEA, that's the law that gives the parents the right to challenge the special education that is being offered to their child by the school district. And so I went through, generally these classifications, but these are some interesting points from that graph, that for the learning disability, it was higher or highest for those who are classified as Pacific Islanders. For speech and language impairments, it was higher for those that are considered Asian. Autism, like I mentioned before, highest for those who are Asian. And intellectual disability, highest for those who are Black. So piggybacking on that with Black students, African American students, being more likely to be identified as intellectually disabled. The statistic is that they're almost 3 times more likely than the other groups. And then also emotional disturbance. Black students are twice as likely to be classified with that disability. Another statistic that Black students with disabilities are 1.6 times more likely to be served in more restrictive settings compared to their white peers. So by restrictiveness, I mean whether there are opportunities to be in the same classroom with children that are general education students or typically functioning. So the more restricted the classroom, the less likely they are to interact with typically developing peers, and usually the smaller the classroom and the more intensive the staffing to teaching, staffing to student ratio. So this leads me to a phenomenon that we call the school to prison pipeline. And it's a hefty title, but I'm gonna break it down. So there is a correlation that we're going to get to in the next couple of slides between the emotional disturbance category and the rates of suspensions. So we have now a correlation between African American students being more likely to be classified with emotional disturbance, and then also more likely to be suspended. And so what the school to prison pipeline is that when students are suspended at a higher rate than they should be, they lose interest in school and attending school. When they've lost that connection to the school community, they are more susceptible to ending up in the juvenile justice system. Next slide, Sonia. So these are the stats. You'll see that across the board, being a male makes you more likely to get suspended than being female. And then the same statistics that we're seeing with Black and African American students, that they're more likely to be suspended as well. And amongst females, that Black girls are more likely, much more likely to be suspended than their other races. Next slide. Okay. So here, with respect to discipline, students that are classified with this disability, which should be comprised of students with psychiatric disorders, you can see the rate is pretty staggering compared to the rates of other disabilities. So it's pretty much off the charts. The next closest one is other health impairment, which usually indicates a physical disability or a special need triggered by a chronic condition that a student has. And just to point out some of the safer classifications with respect to being disciplined: autism, a visual impairment, speech and language impairment. Those disabilities tend to have some, in terms of the statistics, some more protection against suspensions. Next slide. Okay. And what I found interesting as I was looking into the statistics, research on African American children who have symptoms that are similar to autism tend to be initially diagnosed with conduct disorders like emotional disturbance. And they don't get that autism diagnosis until much later. So as you can imagine, a student being punished or disciplined for behavior that perhaps should be labeled as autism, but as emotional disturbance, and being facing the consequences of that. And again, this was just that statistic that it's a nearly 33% suspension rate. And what I found interesting, because I'm a practitioner of special education law, is that school districts are supposed to implement protections for children with disabilities who are accused of disciplinary infractions, and they are not supposed to undergo long-term suspensions without a due process proceeding and without being entitled to services that would still enable them to make progress on their IEP goals. So it is troubling that there is this high suspension rate for those students, and whether the school districts are really paying attention to the due process rights of children that may fall into this category. So instead of suspending them multiple times, perhaps taking another approach that is more therapeutic and less punitive if it is a manifestation of that child's disability. Next slide. Okay, so that was a big topic, and I'm sure we have a lot of things to say about that, but I do want to switch gears because we are looking at national origin in addition to race. Immigrant families with immigrant students with disabilities. So, the title of this was Barriers. So here are some of the barriers that immigrant families face. Obviously, linguistic differences, not being able to speak or read or understand English. A lack of information about the child's progress. Unfamiliarity of the teachers with the culture that the family is coming from. And at the same time, the parents' unfamiliarity with the US practices and everything that they would be entitled to through the special education system. And perhaps there could be some bias from the parents based on a negative interaction that they've had in the past with a school system. And then different viewpoints on parental involvement. There are some cultures where families give a lot of deference to the school officials versus being more of an active participant in the decision making on what the child needs. Okay, next slide. So this was interesting that we pulled from the research. So what if educators, to try and combat that phenomenon of immigrant families feeling confused and lost, what if educators took the time to ask what and find out more about the culture that their students are coming from? So in special education, we have a lot of acronyms, but this one, CLD, stands for culturally and linguistically diverse families. So students that are coming from perhaps a household where English is not the predominant language. So when I talked about participation, I mean showing up to IEP meetings, making your child available for evaluations, asking questions, questioning what's being offered, visiting what's being recommended, and consulting with others, with experts about whether or not to accept it, and then that decision to monitor their child's progress over time. So, not surprisingly, families that fall under this category exhibit lower levels of participation. So that's a huge barrier in and of itself. And here, while Latino parents participate more than Black parents, both groups participate at far fewer, lower rates than white parents. And then we took some research from specific ethnic groups, Mexican immigrant families. They're often uninformed about the type of services that their child is receiving. And Native American families, they indicated that there is a need for more communication with the school and to increase their involvement in the IEP process. So next. So meaningful participation, I mentioned this a lot during this presentation because it's so important for parents to understand that they are perhaps the most important person in this process because they're the only ones who can really be the best advocate for they know the child the best, and they're in that position to invoke what's right for the child. So I had some tips for being a meaningful participant in the process. I went through them quickly just a second ago, but evaluation appointments. If you do get to the point where you're referring your child for an evaluation, or someone you trust, like the child's doctor, is referring them for an evaluation because they're suspecting a delay or a disability, a way to be a meaningful participant is to make your child available for that evaluation, because you can't get to the point of getting an IEP or getting services without initially having your child assessed. So that's usually the first step of the process, which can be anxiety provoking, but we'll get into that a little later. Once those evaluations are done, you want to read your reports, not skim them, but read each word. Ask for help if there are things you don't understand. Read it with another, a professional, an advocate, a doctor, an attorney, because you really want to understand what these reports are saying about your child. You want to be aware if there are any inaccuracies that are in those reports, and you want to look at what the summary or the conclusion is, what's being recommended by the professional who assessed your child. And show up to meetings. While phone participation is acceptable, I think it's best to be able to sit in the room and be at that table, especially at the outset, if it's your first time, because your presence makes a difference, and you can better able to kind of view the body language. You know, you're probably better able to hear what's going on versus being on a speakerphone. So I think this is a really important point if you're going through this process, to do your best to be there in person. And you want to maintain an open line of communication with the teacher. So I'm of the opinion that forging a good relationship with the teacher, even if you disagree with everything they do, I think that open communication is the key, because the last thing you want is to shut out the school and act like the teacher or the principal is your enemy, because it doesn't work to your advantage ultimately. It works best when the educators and the families and parents are working together. But that's not always possible, so we'll get into that a little later. And like I mentioned before, I'm a big proponent of medical and legal partnerships. So outside of the special education evaluation process, consulting with the doctors, whether it's a psychiatrist the child might see, a pediatrician, a developmental pediatrician, a psychologist, a therapist, get them involved, because everyone should be working on the same goals, in my opinion. And then this is important too. Before rejecting a program, whether it's a school or a classroom, go and see it. You need to show that you're at least cooperating to the point that you can reject a placement or a program after you've viewed it and after you've taken all of these steps before, that you're in a better place to know what is right and what isn't right for your child. Next slide. Okay, so structural values placed on school professional attitudes. So this is what I was referencing a bit earlier, is our cultures where they give a lot of deference to school officials, and that sort of minimizes the voice that a parent has. So we pulled this quote, not to be inflammatory, but to be thought-provoking and talk about this a little bit more. So it's referencing these parents, meaning parents that are facing certain barriers. Their limitations are reinforced not only by the lack of knowledge of their rights, but also by school professionals who evade their responsibility and allow parents to remain unaware of their rights. So I am a person who's represented school districts, and I don't believe that educators are purposely evading their responsibility. That is strong language. But school districts are confined in their ability to individualize an education for every single student that comes through their doors. And that's where private schools and private services come into play, because there is not a one-size-fits-all or cookie-cutter approach to special education, and there are limitations in the school district's ability to provide the right education to all the children with special needs, especially when each child is so different in and of themselves. So parents need to be aware of their rights, understand the system, and develop the confidence to work with school professionals. Next slide. So that's where knowledge and advocacy come into play. So for me, I think those go hand in hand. I'm very big on knowledge, knowing what your child's disability is, knowing what research says is the appropriate methodology or treatment, instructional methodology or treatment. You can't challenge what you don't know. So if you don't know, if you don't understand your child's disability, if you don't know what's out there in terms of how to help your child progress, there's nothing for you to challenge. And so that's why I feel that knowledge and advocacy go hand in hand. And for those families who do find themselves in the dark and stressed and overwhelmed because of all of the obstacles that they're facing just to survive day by day, it's so important to seek out assistance and not go through this process alone. So whether it's a family member, whether it's a friend, whether it's a doctor, a pediatrician, an advocate, or an attorney, it is important to have someone you trust be able to voice your opinion if you feel like you don't have the skills to do so. Next slide. So this I found interesting. We didn't have, we didn't include data on Southeast Asian families, so families that are maybe from Pakistan or India, but for East Asian American families versus East Asian parents, there is a difference in how they view special education and how they view a child with special needs. So we pulled this just to give an example of the differences between, let's say, an immigrant and then that first generation American. And I was actually surprised by this research, and I think it's worthy of being up on this slide. So East Asian American parents, so those are the parents that are first generation Americans, they have less acceptance of a child, of their child having a disability, whereas the actual immigrants themselves, immigrant parents, had a higher level of familiarity with the concept of disability and acceptance of it. So for the American, the first generation American, they reported having higher negative feelings about their child that had a diagnosis and felt those emotions of shame and guilt and anger. Here we broke it down further that for those who are Chinese, they're uncomfortable with discussing disability with others. South Koreans reported lower expectations of their child with a disability. Were concerned about the child's ability to be independent in the future and to have a successful life outside of after they leave school. And Taiwanese participants reported that it took them a long time to accept their child who had an intellectual disability. So I did come up with some tips from my experience as a parent and also as a special education attorney. Acceptance is key because we can't really get to the point of figuring out what the right setting is or the right services are, without accepting that a problem exists. And that's an issue in some of these communities that we talk about, is first agreeing that there is something that needs to be worked on. So I bring up assessments. These are the evaluations that your doctor or the teacher may recommend, that they are quantitative. There are issues and about whether assessments are culturally biased against families that come from these ethnic groups or socio-economic groups. But if you do find that your child is performing much lower, significantly lower than the mean, that could be a red flag that an issue exists that needs to be at least looked at more closely. And like I said, I'm a big proponent of getting second and third opinions. There are more specialized pediatricians. They're developmental behavioral pediatricians, and they have more of an expertise in analyzing students who have developmental disabilities, any disability that's impacting their cognitive functioning, their social emotional, their communication, their adaptive skills, their ability to develop those independent living skills, potty training, and also physical, their ability to move, to, obviously physical disabilities can impact a child's learning. And there are also neuropsychologists, so those are doctorate level psychologists that can perform comprehensive evaluations. And I like these evaluations because they usually have recommendations, specific recommendations with respect to how to handle the child at home and in the school environment. So the research indicates that the earlier the intervention, the better the longer term outcome, because the younger the child is, the more, I guess, they absorb the therapies and the treatment. And so it is important that once a disability or a delay is suspected, that intervention is started as soon as possible. And one thing we should all keep in mind is that these services are free. So it's not like a parent has to expend money to get these services, so it makes sense to me to try and use the system to your advantage and not let your fears cloud what's best for your child. Because the ultimate goal is for your child to be happy and healthy and independent. You want them to be able, to the extent possible, to hold down a job and have their own family. And these are, education is so important and crucial to developing that child on the path to independence. And that is actually how the IDEA, the law, is oriented now, that it should be focused more on preparing the child for life outside or after post-secondary school, after high school. Another thing to keep in mind is consent and confidentiality. So for those families that are concerned about labels and fear some stigma on having certain diagnoses, they should know that these are really important laws that protect their child's privacy and their rights as parents. So HIPAA covers medical information. FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and it's actually broader than just HIPAA. So while HIPAA focuses more on medical information, FERPA covers school as well. And so all special education records are protected and should not be released without your signed consent. And by signed, I mean the actual signature. So you, in essence, can decide what reports you want to turn over to the next professional. That happens typically, going from early intervention, let's say from 0 to 3, to preschool special education 3 to 5, that you don't necessarily have to turn over what has already been all the evaluations that have already been done. You're entitled to a fresh set, and you don't need to automatically have what's been diagnosed spill into this new set. So the only caveat is if you are getting an evaluation, an independent evaluation at the expense of the district, you do have to turn those over if you're challenging the district and demanding that they pay for a private evaluation. But otherwise, you have this right to withhold if that's what you feel is best for your child. And then there's a difference between consenting to the evaluations and consenting to the services. So just because you have consented to your child being assessed doesn't mean you have to consent to the program that's being recommended. So you still need to give signed and informed consent to the district before services start. So for example, let's say a meeting is held, your child has been recommended to go from a general education classroom of 30 kids to now an integrated classroom, slightly smaller but with 2 teachers. You don't have to accept. They have to, before they physically place your child in that smaller classroom, you have to give your informed consent. The next slide. Okay, we are switching gears now to economic status. So this graph shows students with re-evaluation referrals. So these are not students who are initially referred. These are children who have already been classified and they're up for a re-evaluation, which typically happens every 3 years. So with these numbers, out of the total number of kids that are up for reevaluation during this particular school year, the 15-16 school year, 17,000, almost 18,000 out of the 24,000 are eligible for free and reduced lunch. So that means they're at or below the U.S. federal poverty guidelines. The next slide. So that's 75%, the 18,000 out of 26, I think 26,000. And so the question is why? Why is it that such a large percentage of students that are coming from low-income backgrounds are already enmeshed in the special ed system? Why are the rates higher, rates of disability higher for that population? The next slide. So again, we kind of look at what research says the factors are. Obviously, limited familiarity with English. We spoke about that. When you're an immigrant, if you don't have as many community ties and school ties as someone who was born here and who's lived here. Parental human capital, fewer financial resources. Being able to function as a household where the parent has the ability to not only hold a job but to manage these other aspects of their children's lives. And research has shown that each of these factors correlate to an increased likelihood of special education placement. So the impact on health diagnosis, the lack for immigrant families, the lack of health insurance or lack of easy access to health insurance impacts that, especially for younger children, that early intervention referral. So those of you who've raised small kids, you know that from the time the child's born up until they're 2, there are multiple appointments where the pediatrician tracks the child's growth, not only their physical growth, but also whether they're meeting their developmental milestones on time. And if a parent doesn't have health insurance, they're missing those opportunities because these are well visits. They're not emergency room visits, but these are visits where a doctor can see over time whether the child is approaching their developmental milestones on time. And here it says Hispanic, Latino children are more likely to be uninsured, less likely to be referred to a specialist if there is an issue detected, and they have limited access to the healthcare information. So the next slide. So here I just mentioned there are a number of laws that play into special education. The main one is the IDEA, but the precursor to the No Child Left Behind Act, that was under George Bush, and then the current Every Student Succeeds Act was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And so in that act, Congress said that they want to make sure that poor and minority students are not taught at higher rates by inexperienced teachers. So this is where that requirement of having a qualified and competent teacher comes from, this law that has now had some iterations since then. The next slide. So teacher quality obviously will have an impact on student success. So we've reached the end of the slide, I think, in good timing. My takeaway points as a special education attorney and as a parent is to trust your instinct. Because, like I mentioned earlier, there's no one who knows your child better than you who are raising the child and living with the child every day. And so there is an intimidation to accept what someone else may be saying after meeting your child for an hour or 2 hours, a month apart. But it's so important for probably your own sanity to listen to what your gut is saying about your child and what they need. Again, I'm big on knowledge and how that ties in with advocacy. Knowledge is your friend. You want to arm yourself with it. You want to learn as much as you can about the diagnosis, the disability, so that now you can advocate for what your child needs. Knowing your rights. So knowing that there are options besides what the public school is offering, that knowledge is power, because you know that you can be more selective. You don't necessarily have to accept what has been offered. And again, with parents that are facing those fears and the stigma, you have to put your child's needs above those, and that's the best advice I can give. You want to be an active participant, like I mentioned before. You want to show up, you want to be engaged, you want to be responsive if a teacher is telling you something. You want that line of a communication developed and a parent, because you never know if the teacher is sort of sitting in your place when you're at work or if you're at home with other children, and you definitely at least want to be able to interact effectively and professionally with those that are educating your children. And last, build a support network. So this is obviously going to be difficult for families that are, basically struggling with having their basic needs met. But to the extent possible, as much as you can, find family members, friends, advocates. There are free advocacy groups and also free legal services to be a part of that network. So going back to the parent who doesn't read English and is provided a 10-page evaluation of their child and doesn't know what to do with this, that's the point where you do seek out someone who can help you understand it, and who can talk you through what your options are. Yeah, the next slide. And I would challenge you to consider special education not as a handicap, but as a way to level the playing field for your child, to set your child up for success. It doesn't necessarily have to be long-term assistance, but the sooner that you can get those appropriate supports in place, the better the outcomes are for your child, and the more likely they are to be able to lead an independent and successful life as happy individuals, which is most important. So the last slide, you guys didn't interrupt me much for questions, so I know this was a lot of information and a lot of heavy information and details.